Nobody looked at Emily Harper when she walked into the room. Except the dog. The morning rain had left thin silver streaks across the tall windows of Jefferson Veterans Medical Center in Norfolk, Virginia. Beyond the glass, the parking lot shimmered beneath a gray coastal sky, and a cold Atlantic wind rattled the flagpole outside the main entrance. Inside, the hospital moved with its usual rhythm. Phones rang. Stretchers rolled. Coffee steamed from paper cups clutched by exhausted nurses beginning another 12-hour shift. Yet somehow, in a building filled with hundreds of people, Emily Harper managed to feel invisible. She adjusted the badge clipped neatly to her navy blue scrubs and stepped into the nurse's station carrying a patient chart against her chest. 28 years old, fair-skinned, with light brown hair tied into a practical ponytail, Emily looked younger than she actually was. That alone seemed enough for some people to dismiss her. 3 weeks earlier she had arrived full of hope, believing hard work would earn respect. Instead, she quickly learned that respect was not always given to the quietest person in the room. "You're on supply inventory again," nurse supervisor Linda Brooks said without looking up from her computer screen. "But I worked inventory yesterday," Emily replied gently. Linda finally glanced at her. "Then you'll be great at it today." A few nurses nearby exchanged knowing smiles. Emily lowered her eyes and nodded. "Yes, ma'am. It was always like this. The difficult shifts. The paperwork nobody wanted. The endless errands. When mistakes happened, someone found a way to blame the new nurse. When things went well, nobody noticed." By noon, she had crossed nearly 3 miles of hospital hallways according to the step counter on her watch. She delivered medications, updated charts, transported equipment, and helped elderly veterans who thanked everyone except her because they rarely remembered her name. Yet she never complained. Maybe because she understood pain better than most people realized. Her father had worn a uniform once. A Navy corpsman. A man who taught her that service was not about recognition. It was about showing up even when nobody applauded. The automatic doors near the emergency entrance suddenly slid open. A gust of cool air swept through the lobby. Several people looked up. Security guards straightened. Conversations paused. A black SUV had arrived outside. Emily barely noticed at first. She was focused on organizing supplies behind the station. Then she heard something unusual. Not barking. Not growling. The sharp clicking of large paws against polished hospital floors. Heads turned one after another. A German shepherd entered the building. He was enormous. Broad-shouldered, muscular, his sable coat gleaming beneath the fluorescent lights. Every movement carried discipline and purpose. A working dog. A K9. Walking beside him were 2 men in military attire escorting a patient on a rolling bed. The dog ignored everyone. Doctors. Nurses. Security officers. Visitors. He passed them all without hesitation. Then he stopped. 50 feet away. His ears lifted. His amber eyes locked onto someone across the room. Emily. The clipboard slipped slightly in her hands. The dog stared as if he recognized her. As if he had been searching for her. And before anyone could understand what was happening, the German shepherd turned and began walking directly toward the nurse nobody seemed to notice. The entire nurse's station fell silent. Emily could hear the distant hum of fluorescent lights overhead and the faint beeping of monitors from nearby patient rooms. The German shepherd moved with calm certainty, his powerful frame cutting through the crowd as though every step had already been decided long before he entered the building. Several nurses instinctively stepped aside. One doctor paused mid-conversation. Even the security guard near the entrance watched with raised eyebrows. Emily remained frozen beside the supply counter. Her fingers tightened around the clipboard. She had never seen the dog before in her life. At least she did not think she had. Yet something about those amber eyes stirred a strange feeling she could not explain. The shepherd stopped directly in front of her. For a moment neither moved. The dog studied her face. Then, to everyone's astonishment, he slowly sat down and rested his head against her leg. A quiet murmur spread through the room. "No way," one nurse whispered. "That is a military working dog." "He does not even do that with his handlers," another replied. Emily carefully lowered one hand. "Hey there, buddy." The dog immediately leaned into her touch. Not cautiously. Not reluctantly. Completely. His tail brushed softly against the polished floor. The reaction felt so natural it was as though he had known her for years. "Titan." The voice came from behind the gathering crowd. Deep. Calm. Authoritative. The dog lifted his ears but did not leave Emily's side. The crowd parted. A tall man in his early 40s approached from the elevator corridor. His posture carried the unmistakable confidence of someone accustomed to responsibility. Short sandy blonde hair framed a weathered face marked more by experience than age. His gray eyes scanned the scene before settling on the dog. "That is not like him," he said quietly. Emily straightened. "I am sorry. I did not call him over." "I know you did not." The man extended a hand. "Chief Warrant Officer Daniel Mercer. Navy Liaison." Emily shook it politely. "Emily Harper." Daniel glanced at Titan again. "I have worked with this dog for nearly 4 years. He usually ignores everyone." Titan remained seated beside Emily, completely uninterested in moving. A faint smile appeared on Daniel's face. "Apparently today is different." Before Emily could respond, an orderly hurried toward Daniel carrying paperwork. "Sir, the patient has been transferred to intensive care." Daniel nodded. "Thank you." Emily watched as concern briefly crossed his expression. Whoever had arrived in the hospital was clearly important. "Is everything all right?" she asked. Daniel hesitated. A Navy SEAL was brought in early this morning from a training accident off the Carolina coast. Lieutenant Mason Reed. Several nearby staff members exchanged surprised looks. Even among civilians, the name carried weight. Daniel continued carefully. "He is stable, but the next few days will be important." Emily glanced toward the elevator doors that had already closed behind the patient transport team. Something about the situation felt heavier than the brief explanation suggested. Titan suddenly stood and looked toward the intensive care wing. His ears remained alert. Then, unexpectedly, he returned his gaze to Emily. The dog took 2 steps closer and settled beside her feet again. Refusing to leave. Daniel let out a slow breath. "Well," he said softly, almost to himself, "that is the first mystery of the day." None of them realized that before the week was over, Titan's choice would uncover a secret hidden far deeper than anyone inside Jefferson Veterans Medical Center could possibly imagine. By late afternoon, the rain had stopped, leaving the hospital grounds wrapped in a cool silver light. Long shadows stretched across the parking lot, and the scent of wet pavement drifted through the automatic doors each time someone entered. Inside Jefferson Veterans Medical Center, the day continued as it always did. Nurses hurried between rooms. Phones rang endlessly. Elevators opened and closed with soft mechanical chimes. Yet one thing had changed. Titan had not left Emily Harper's side for nearly 6 hours. The German shepherd lay beside the nurse's station while she worked, his large head resting on his paws, amber eyes following her every movement. Whenever she disappeared into a patient room, he waited by the door. Whenever she returned, his tail tapped quietly against the floor. The behavior had become the subject of conversation throughout the building. "It is almost like he is guarding her," one orderly remarked. "Or watching over her," another answered. Emily tried to ignore the attention. She focused on charts, medications, and patient care. Still, every time she glanced down and found Titan calmly sitting nearby, a strange feeling settled inside her chest. Not fear. Not discomfort. Something closer to familiarity. Near 6 o'clock, Daniel Mercer returned from intensive care carrying a stack of reports. He looked tired. The lines around his eyes seemed deeper than they had earlier. Titan immediately stood when he approached. "Easy, boy," Daniel said. The dog obeyed but remained close to Emily. Daniel shook his head with quiet disbelief. "I still cannot figure this out." Emily smiled politely. "Maybe he just likes me." "Titan does not just like people." Daniel lowered his voice. "He evaluates them. That dog has spent years around some of the most disciplined men in the military. Trust does not come easily to him." Emily glanced at the shepherd. "Then maybe he sees something I do not." Daniel studied her for a moment but said nothing. Before he could respond, an announcement echoed through the hallway. A physician was being paged to intensive care. Daniel's expression immediately changed. "Excuse me." He turned and headed toward the elevator. The moment the doors closed behind him, Titan stood. His ears lifted. His body became perfectly still. Emily noticed the change instantly. "What is it?" she whispered. The dog stared toward the intensive care wing. Seconds passed. Then he began walking. Not quickly. Not urgently. Purposefully. Emily hesitated before following. The corridor grew quieter as they moved deeper into the restricted section of the hospital. Soft evening light filtered through narrow windows overlooking the Chesapeake Bay. At the end of the hallway stood a large glass panel revealing one of the intensive care rooms. Titan stopped there. Inside, Lieutenant Mason Reed lay motionless beneath clean white blankets. Machines monitored his condition with steady green lines and gentle electronic tones. The room was peaceful. Almost too peaceful. Emily had expected someone larger than life after hearing people speak about him all day. Instead she saw a man resting quietly, his face calm, his sandy brown hair slightly tousled against the pillow. A silver military challenge coin sat beside a framed photograph on the table near his bed. In the picture, Mason stood smiling beside Titan beneath a bright desert sky. Emily stared at the image. Something flickered inside her memory. A feeling. A fragment. Gone before she could grasp it. Titan stepped closer to the glass. His nose touched the surface. Then, unexpectedly, he looked back at Emily. Not once. Twice. As if trying to tell her something. As if the reason he had found her that morning had always been connected to the man resting silently on the other side of the window. And for the first time since Titan entered the hospital, Emily felt certain of one thing. Somehow, in a way she could not yet explain, their paths had crossed before. That night, long after most visitors had gone home, Jefferson Veterans Medical Center settled into the quiet rhythm that only hospitals know. The hallways grew dimmer. Conversations softened. Outside, a blanket of fog rolled in from the Chesapeake Bay, wrapping the city lights in a pale silver glow. Emily Harper stood alone at a medication cart near the intensive care wing, reviewing patient charts beneath the muted light of a wall lamp. Somewhere in the distance, a floor buffer hummed softly against polished tile. The smell of fresh coffee drifted from an empty staff lounge. It should have felt peaceful. Instead, she could not stop thinking about the photograph beside Mason Reed's bed. She had seen thousands of faces during her training and early nursing career. Yet something about his seemed familiar. Not recognizable. Familiar. Like hearing a song you have not heard in years but somehow still remember. Emily closed the chart and glanced through the glass panel again. Mason remained motionless. The steady rhythm of monitors painted green reflections across the room. Titan was lying outside the door now, stretched across the floor with his head resting between his paws. Most service animals eventually settled when separated from their handlers. Titan did not. He watched. He waited. Every few minutes his eyes moved from Mason to Emily and back again. As though he were protecting both of them. Emily slowly approached him. "You really do not want to leave him, do you?" she whispered. Titan lifted his head. His ears twitched. Then he nudged her hand gently with his nose. The simple gesture triggered something unexpected. A memory. Brief. Faint. Gone almost instantly. A concrete hallway. Bright emergency lights. The smell of antiseptic. A dog barking somewhere nearby. Emily blinked and pulled her hand back. Her heart was suddenly beating faster. "What was that?" she murmured. Before she could think further, a voice interrupted from behind. "You are still here." Emily turned. Dr. Richard Sloane stood in the corridor holding a tablet. He was one of the hospital's senior physicians, respected by nearly everyone on staff. Tall, sharply dressed, and always composed, he carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to being listened to. "Just finishing some chart reviews," Emily replied. Dr. Sloane nodded politely, though his smile seemed unusually brief. His eyes shifted toward the intensive care room. Lieutenant Reed remained stable. "That is good news." "Yes, sir. Hopefully we can avoid complications." The word sounded normal enough, yet something about his tone unsettled her. Perhaps it was simply exhaustion. Perhaps not. Titan suddenly stood. The movement was immediate and deliberate. A low rumble vibrated deep inside his chest. Not aggressive. Not threatening. Warning. Emily froze. Dr. Sloane looked down at the dog. Interesting. Titan did not break eye contact. The shepherd's body became rigid. His ears pinned forward. Every muscle seemed alert. For several uncomfortable seconds the hallway remained completely silent. Then Dr. Sloane laughed lightly. "Looks like I have not earned his approval." He adjusted the tablet under his arm and continued down the corridor. The moment he disappeared around the corner, Titan relaxed. The change was instant. Emily stared after the doctor. Her pulse quickened again. She knelt beside the dog. "You did not like that, did you?" Titan remained focused on the direction Dr. Sloane had gone. Then he slowly turned back toward Mason's room. Emily followed his gaze. Through the glass she noticed something she had not paid attention to earlier. A small sealed folder sitting beneath several medical reports near the bedside workstation. Nothing unusual. Yet for reasons she could not explain, she suddenly felt certain that somewhere inside this hospital, a piece of the story was missing. And somehow Titan already knew it. The hospital clock above the intensive care desk read 11:17 p.m. Most of the building had settled into the strange stillness that arrives after visiting hours end. The bright energy of daytime had faded, replaced by soft monitor tones, distant footsteps, and the low hum of air vents pushing cool air through empty corridors. Emily Harper sat alone at a workstation reviewing patient records while Titan rested nearby. The German shepherd appeared calm, but every few minutes his ears lifted toward Mason Reed's room. It was as if some invisible thread connected them. Emily rubbed her tired eyes and opened another chart. Then something caught her attention. A medication schedule. At first glance it looked routine. She almost moved on. Almost. But a small detail stopped her. The dosage listed in the evening update did not match the dosage recorded earlier that afternoon. Emily frowned. She pulled up the previous entry. Then another. Her pulse quickened. The numbers were different. Not dramatically. Just enough to raise concern. She checked the timestamp. The record had been modified less than 2 hours earlier. "That is strange," she whispered. Titan lifted his head immediately. Emily opened additional files. The deeper she looked, the more questions appeared. Several entries had been adjusted. Notes had been shortened. Observations were missing. None of it looked obvious enough to trigger an alert, yet together they formed a pattern she could not ignore. A cold sensation crept through her stomach. She printed several pages and compared them side by side beneath the desk lamp. The hospital was quiet enough that she could hear paper sliding against paper. Outside the window, fog drifted across the parking lot beneath pale streetlights. Everything seemed peaceful. Yet the records in front of her told a different story. Titan suddenly stood. Emily looked up. The dog was staring down the corridor again. His posture had become rigid. Not frightened. Focused. She followed his gaze. A figure appeared at the far end of the hallway. Dr. Richard Sloane. He walked with his usual confidence, carrying a tablet beneath one arm. Titan's eyes never left him. The low rumble returned to the dog's chest. Barely audible. Enough for Emily to hear. Dr. Sloane approached the workstation and offered a courteous smile. Working late again? Emily quickly covered the printed records. Just finishing documentation. That kind of dedication is rare these days. His smile remained polite, but something about it felt distant. His eyes drifted briefly toward the papers beneath her hand. Only for a second. Then he looked back at her. Do not stay too late. You need rest if you want to survive this profession. I will be done soon. He nodded and continued walking. The moment he disappeared around the corner, Titan relaxed again. Emily stared after him. Her heart was beating faster now. She looked down at the records once more. The discrepancies were still there. Real. Unexplained. Then another memory flickered through her mind. A hospital corridor years earlier. Emergency lights reflecting off polished floors. A man on a stretcher. A German shepherd barking somewhere nearby. The image vanished before she could fully grasp it. Emily slowly exhaled. Somewhere inside Jefferson Veterans Medical Center, a piece of the truth had been hidden. And for reasons she did not yet understand, both her instincts and Titan seemed determined to find it. At 2:13 in the morning, the hospital seemed suspended between worlds. The day staff were gone. Most visitors had long since returned home. Even the sounds of the city outside had faded beneath the thick coastal fog pressing softly against the windows. Emily Harper remained at the workstation near intensive care, unable to shake the feeling that something important was hiding in plain sight. The printed records lay spread across the desk beneath a small reading lamp. She reviewed them again. Then again. Every comparison led to the same conclusion. Information had been altered. Small details. Tiny changes. Easy to overlook. Yet the pattern was impossible to ignore once she saw it. Titan remained beside her chair. Suddenly the dog stood. His ears snapped forward. A second later an alarm sounded from down the hallway. Not loud. Not chaotic. But urgent enough to send nurses moving immediately toward Mason Reed's room. Emily was already on her feet. She followed the team through the doorway. The room filled with activity. Monitors displayed changing readings. Staff moved calmly and professionally around the bed. Emily stepped toward the workstation inside the room and began reviewing the latest information being relayed through the system. Then her stomach tightened. One medication entry did not match the dosage listed in the original treatment plan. It was the same discrepancy she had noticed earlier. The same change hidden among the records. Her eyes moved rapidly between screens. The difference seemed small. Yet under the circumstances it mattered. Wait, she said quietly. Nobody heard her. Wait. A nurse nearby continued entering data. Emily stepped closer. The dosage history does not match the original physician order. This time several people looked up. One physician frowned. "What are you seeing?" Emily quickly pointed to the timestamps. Her voice remained calm despite the pounding in her chest. The adjustment was entered later. The original recommendation was different. The room fell silent for a brief moment. Another physician reviewed the records. Then another. Seconds felt like minutes. Finally one of them nodded slowly. "She is right." Additional checks followed immediately. Corrections were made. The atmosphere remained controlled, but the tension shifted. Emily stepped back and released a breath she had not realized she was holding. Across the room, Titan had not moved. His amber eyes remained fixed on the medical workstation rather than the bed. As though he understood exactly where the problem had originated. A short time later the situation stabilized. The room grew quieter. Staff returned to their duties. One of the senior nurses approached Emily. "Good catch." The word surprised her more than they should have. Few people had ever said that. Emily offered a modest smile and returned to the hallway. The first hint of dawn was beginning to lighten the eastern horizon beyond the windows. Soft blue light filtered into the corridor. Titan walked beside her. For the first time all night, the German Shepherd appeared slightly more relaxed. Then the elevator doors opened. Daniel Mercer stepped out carrying a travel mug of coffee. He immediately noticed the expressions on the faces around him. "What happened?" he asked. A nurse answered before Emily could speak. The new girl spotted something nobody else caught. Daniel looked at Emily. Then at Titan. The dog sat quietly beside her. Daniel exhaled slowly. Interesting. It was the same word he had used when Titan first chose her. But this time it carried a different meaning. Because somewhere between midnight and sunrise, the nurse nobody noticed had become the person who might hold the first piece of a much larger truth. The sunrise arrived quietly over Norfolk, washing the hospital windows with pale gold light. Night staff exchanged tired smiles with the morning crew while coffee machines hissed awake throughout Jefferson Veterans Medical Center. Yet despite the beginning of a new day, Emily Harper could not stop thinking about the records she had reviewed during the night. Something remained wrong. Not obvious enough to alarm everyone else. Just enough to leave a question sitting heavily in the back of her mind. Titan seemed to share the feeling. The German Shepherd stayed unusually close as Emily moved through the intensive care wing. Every so often he glanced toward Mason Reed's room, then toward the administrative offices farther down the hall. It was becoming difficult to ignore. Around 8 o'clock, Daniel Mercer arrived carrying fresh reports from military command. He looked less exhausted than the night before, though concern still lingered behind his gray eyes. He stopped outside Mason's room and reviewed the monitor readings through the glass. "Stable," he whispered. "Come on, Lieutenant. We are all waiting for you." Emily was updating notes nearby when Daniel approached her. "I heard about what happened overnight." She lowered her eyes. "I was just doing my job." Daniel smiled faintly. "That answer tells me more than you realize." Before Emily could respond, movement inside the room caught their attention. One of the nurses stepped back from the bedside monitor. Another immediately leaned closer to observe. Daniel straightened. "What is happening?" The door opened. A physician emerged with cautious optimism on his face. "There is increased responsiveness." Daniel froze. "You mean?" "I mean he may be waking up." For the next hour, anticipation spread quietly through the unit. Staff moved with renewed energy. Phone calls were made. Specialists checked. Readings. Titan remained seated outside the room, completely focused on the door. His ears never lowered once. Emily noticed that he refused food and water during that time. It was as though every part of him was waiting for a single moment. Then it happened. Shortly after 9:15, a nurse stepped into the hallway and smiled. "He is awake." Daniel closed his eyes briefly in relief. Several staff members exchanged grateful looks. Titan immediately stood. His tail moved once. Then again. Not wildly. Just enough to reveal the emotion he had been holding back for days. Emily found herself smiling too. Through the partially open doorway she could see Mason sitting slightly elevated against the hospital bed. His face looked pale from exhaustion, but his eyes were open. Alert. Present. Daniel entered first. Their conversation remained private, but the relief on both faces was unmistakable. A few minutes later Daniel stepped back into the hallway. "Lieutenant Reed is asking questions already." One of the nurses laughed softly. "That sounds promising." Daniel nodded. The first thing he asked was whether Titan was safe. The German shepherd seemed to understand his name immediately. His ears lifted. Then Daniel added something unexpected. The second thing he asked was who found the discrepancy in his treatment records. Emily blinked. "What?" Daniel looked directly at her. "I told him it was a nurse named Emily Harper." The hallway suddenly felt very quiet. Titan walked to her side and sat down. A moment later the room door opened again. Mason Reed appeared tired but determined as he looked across the corridor. His gaze moved past doctors, nurses, and staff members until it landed on Emily. Recognition flashed across his face. Real recognition. Not the vague familiarity of strangers. Something deeper. Something older. Then, with a voice rough from days of silence, he spoke words that made Emily's heart stop for a second. "I know her." For several seconds nobody spoke. The sounds of the hospital seemed to disappear into the distance. Emily Harper stood frozen beside Titan while every eye in the hallway shifted between her and Mason Reed. The Navy SEAL looked exhausted, his face pale beneath the morning light streaming through the windows, yet there was no uncertainty in his expression. He knew exactly who he was looking at. Emily searched her memory again. The same fragments returned. Bright emergency lights. A crowded trauma unit. The smell of antiseptic. A German shepherd refusing to leave someone's side. Then Daniel Mercer stepped forward. "Lieutenant, you know Nurse Harper?" Mason nodded slowly. "Not just know her." His voice remained rough but steady. "She saved my life." The statement landed like a stone in still water. Emily blinked. "I think you have the wrong person." Mason gave a faint smile. "That sounds exactly like something you would say." Titan moved closer to the bed, his tail brushing softly against the floor. For the first time since arriving at the hospital, the dog looked completely at peace. Mason rested a hand on the shepherd's head. 5 years ago, he said quietly, there was a military medical center outside Jacksonville. I was brought in after an operation overseas. I barely remember most of it. But I remember one person refusing to give up when everyone else thought I would be fine waiting for another specialist. Emily stared at him. The forgotten memory suddenly became clearer. She had been a nursing student during her final clinical rotation. Young. Nervous. Desperate to prove she belonged. Mason continued. You noticed something wrong in my chart. A detail everyone else missed. You kept pushing until a senior physician reviewed it. The corridor around her seemed to blur. She remembered the night now. Not every detail. Just enough. A young service member. A working dog that refused to leave the waiting area. Hours of uncertainty. Endless paperwork. That was you, she whispered. Mason nodded. And that dog was Titan. Emily looked down at the German shepherd. Suddenly the familiarity in his eyes made sense. Titan had not recognized her because she was important. He recognized her because he remembered kindness. Daniel exhaled softly. That is why he went straight to her. Dogs do not forget people who show up when it matters, Mason replied. Several nurses exchanged surprised looks. The nurse nobody respected had quietly crossed paths with one of the most decorated men in the building years before. Yet Emily had never told anyone. She had never even mentioned it. Then Mason's expression changed slightly. The warmth remained, but concern appeared beneath it. There is something else. The hallway grew quiet again. The discrepancy she found in my records. He glanced toward the nurse's station. That was not the first one. Emily felt her pulse quicken. Daniel immediately looked at him. What do you mean? Mason took a slow breath. Before I lost consciousness, I remember questioning information in one of my transfer summaries. Something did not add up. Titan's ears lifted. The same alert posture returned. Mason followed the dog's gaze down the corridor toward the administrative offices. I could not prove it then, he said. But if Emily found another inconsistency, maybe the problem never disappeared. The warmth of reunion faded beneath a new realization. Titan had not spent days trying to reconnect old friends. He had been trying to point them towards something hidden. And for the first time, Emily understood why the German Shepherd had refused to leave her side. The afternoon sunlight stretched across the hospital floor in long bands of gold as the pieces finally began to fall into place. What started as a strange encounter between a German Shepherd and an overlooked nurse had become something far larger. Daniel Mercer spent the next several hours reviewing transfer records alongside hospital administrators. Independent auditors were contacted. Archived documentation was compared against current files. By evening, the conclusion was impossible to ignore. Several records connected to multiple patient transfers contained unexplained alterations. Some were minor. Some affected important treatment notes. None of them should have happened. The discovery sent a quiet wave through Jefferson Veterans Medical Center. Not panic. Reflection. Questions were asked. Procedures were reviewed. And for the first time, people listened carefully to the nurse whose concerns had once been dismissed. Emily Harper never asked for attention. She never demanded recognition. She continued moving through her shift exactly as she always had, checking patients, updating charts, offering warm blankets to veterans resting in recovery rooms. Yet something around her had changed. Staff members who barely acknowledged her before now greeted her by name. Physicians paused to hear her observations. Even nurse supervisor Linda Brooks seemed different. Late that evening she approached Emily near the nurse's station holding 2 cups of coffee. You earned this, Linda said quietly. Emily accepted the cup with a surprised smile. Thank you. Linda hesitated. I should have listened more carefully from the beginning. Emily looked down at the steam rising from the coffee. Then she smiled gently. We are all busy. I understand. The answer somehow made Linda feel even smaller. Across the corridor, Titan lay outside Mason Reed's room. The German Shepherd looked peaceful for the first time since arriving at the hospital. His mission, whatever it had been, seemed complete. Inside the room, Mason's strength continued to return. The doctors expected a full recovery. As sunset painted the sky beyond the windows in shades of amber and violet, he sat beside the bed reviewing messages from teammates and friends. When Emily entered to perform a routine check, Mason looked up and smiled. You know, he said, 5 years ago I thought I would never see you again. Emily laughed softly. 5 years ago I did not think you remembered me. Mason glanced toward Titan. I did not forget. He did not either. The German Shepherd lifted his head at the sound of their voices and walked slowly across the room. He stopped beside Emily and rested his head against her hand exactly as he had on the first day. Emily stroked the thick fur behind his ears. Outside, evening settled gently over Norfolk. The last rays of sunlight faded from the bay. Hospital lights glowed warmly against the coming darkness. For a long moment nobody spoke. They simply sat together in the quiet. A nurse who believed nobody noticed her. A Navy SEAL who remembered a kindness from years ago. And a loyal dog who never forgot either one. Daniel paused outside the doorway as he passed and smiled at the scene. Some stories ended with applause. Some ended with promotions or medals. This one ended with something quieter. Respect. The kind that cannot be demanded. The kind that must be earned one small act at a time. As the hallway lights dimmed for the evening shift, Titan settled at Emily's feet and closed his eyes. Mason looked toward the window where the first stars appeared above the darkening coast. Then he spoke the words that seemed to capture everything that had happened. The best people are usually the ones nobody notices until the day they are needed most. Emily looked down, humbled as always. But this time, she was not invisible. And everyone knew it.